My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 67 years old, and for the better part of this past year, I convinced myself that what my son did to me was love. That's the cruelest part about being deceived by your own blood. You spend so much time protecting the lie because the truth is simply too painful to hold. My wife Carol passed away 10 months before any of this began. Pancreatic cancer. 41 years of marriage, and she was gone in 4 months from diagnosis to burial. The house we had raised Daniel in, the one in Naperville with the porch swing she loved and the vegetable garden she tended every spring, it became a tomb overnight. I would wake up at 2 in the morning reaching for her side of the bed and find nothing but cold sheets. I stopped cooking. I stopped answering the phone. I just sat in that house and slowly turned to dust along with it. Daniel drove up one Saturday in October with his wife Serena. They sat across from me at the kitchen table, Carol's old ceramic rooster still on the counter behind them, and they wore the expressions of people who had rehearsed what they were about to say. My son put his hand over mine. He said, "Dad, you shouldn't be alone in this house anymore." And I believed him. Because I wanted to. Because grief makes you desperate for anything that sounds like a solution. The idea sounded reasonable enough. They had found a duplex in the western suburbs, a solid brick building in Downers Grove, 2 units, both occupied by long-term tenants. The kind of property that paid for itself every month and appreciated quietly in the background. Daniel had done the research. He pulled up the spreadsheets on his laptop right there at Carol's kitchen table and walked me through the numbers. Serena sat beside him, nodding at each figure, like she had built the model herself. The asking price was $1.2 million. Daniel had $150,000 he could put in. The rest, he said carefully, not quite meeting my eyes, would need to come from you, Dad, from the house sale. He said it gently, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. He said it would be an investment, not a gift. He said we would form an LLC together, 50-50 partners, legally protected, each of us with equal say. He said Carol would have wanted me to do something meaningful with the money, something that created stability, something that kept us connected as a family. He actually said that. Carol would have wanted this. I sold the house in Naperville 3 weeks later. I wired $850,000 into the new joint account for Calloway Family Holdings LLC. Patrick Lund, my attorney, is a man I have known for over 20 years. He is meticulous in the way that small, precise men often are. And when I came to him with the operating agreement Daniel and Serena had drafted, he read every page twice before he said a single word. Then he looked at me over his glasses and said, "Frank, this agreement gives you equity, but it doesn't give you control. I want to add some language. Standard protective clauses. Just to keep things clean." I remember Daniel was impatient when I told him Patrick wanted to revise the document. Serena was pleasant about it on the surface, which I now recognize as her telling sign. She smiled and said, "Of course, whatever makes you comfortable, Frank." But her eyes said something else entirely. Patrick added 3 provisions. A fiduciary duty clause requiring both members to use LLC funds only for documented business expenses. A consent clause barring either party from encumbering or transferring their interest without written approval from the other, and a penalty provision. If either member violated those terms, the other had the right to trigger a compulsory buyout at fair market value, plus a 30% premium. Daniel signed it. Serena signed it. I filed it with the state of Illinois on a Tuesday in November, 2 days before Thanksgiving. That was the last time I felt like a partner in anything. The shift was subtle at first, the way structural damage usually is. You don't notice the crack until the wall is already leaning. Serena had volunteered to manage the day-to-day operations of the property, and since she worked from home managing what she called her lifestyle brand, she had the time. I told myself, this made sense. I told myself she was helping. She began CCing me less on the tenant emails. Then not at all. When I asked Daniel about a repair invoice I hadn't approved, he said, "Dad, Serena has it handled. You don't need to worry about every little thing. That phrase. Every little thing. I heard it a dozen times over the following months, and each time it landed like a small flat stone, dropped in still water. By spring, I was receiving a monthly summary document instead of real-time access to the accounts. By summer, when I called the property management software company to ask about my login credentials, I was informed that the account had been updated to a single administrator, Serena's email address. I drove down to see Daniel on a Thursday evening in July. I brought a bottle of the bourbon we used to share when Carol was still alive, the kind she had always teased us about overanalyzing. Daniel met me at the door. He looked tired in a specific way I recognized, the tired of a man who has been having the same argument in his head on repeat for weeks. He poured 2 glasses. We sat in the living room and I told him plainly that I felt I was being shut out of a business I had funded with my life savings. I told him I needed my login restored and I needed to be consulted on expenditures over $500, as the operating agreement stipulated. He rubbed the back of his neck. He didn't look at me directly. He said, "Serena is really efficient, Dad. She's built systems. If you start second-guessing every decision, it slows everything down." I said I wasn't second-guessing anything. I said I was exercising my legal right as a co-owner of the LLC. The word legal seemed to land badly. He set his glass down and said, "I didn't think you'd make this so formal." I said, "I didn't think I'd need to." Serena came home while we were still talking. She was carrying shopping bags, 2 of them, with the kind of thick matte paper and rope handles that signal a price tag you don't ask about. She said hello to me with precisely the amount of warmth required to appear normal and then disappeared upstairs. When she came back down, she had changed into yoga clothes, and she sat in the chair across from us with her phone in her hand and a look on her face like a woman who had walked into a meeting she had already won. She said, "Frank, I completely understand your concern." She paused for effect. "But I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty." She looked at Daniel when she said that, not at me. Managing this property has become basically a full-time job. I have put in hundreds of hours over the past 8 months, developing vendor relationships, renegotiating the tenant leases, coordinating the HVAC replacement. She folded her hands in her lap. "I have not charged the LLC a single penny for my time. I've been doing this as a contribution to our family's investment. But if you want formal approval processes and dual signatures on every receipt, I can step back entirely." And then she looked at me with that smile, the one that offers a choice she knows you cannot take. "Is that what you want, Frank? Because I can do that." I drove home that night feeling like a man who had walked into a closed door in the dark. I knew I had not won the conversation. I also knew I had not imagined any of it. I started paying closer attention. I am a retired civil engineer. For 35 years, my job was to find the flaw in the system before the system found it for you. I began downloading every bank statement I could still access through the LLC's secondary account portal, the one Serena had not thought to restrict. I printed them at the office supply store on Route 53 and spread them across my kitchen table in Carol's old house, the one I was renting now in a smaller place in Wheaton, and I read every line. The first thing I noticed was the subscriptions. 12 software platforms I had never heard of. Monthly recurring charges ranging from $49 to $300 each, all billed to the LLC account. Some of them I could trace back to property management tools. Others had names that meant nothing. Luminary Studio, Creator Kit Pro, Styleboard Premium. I wrote them all down. Then, I found the receipts. 4 charges to a restaurant in River North, totaling over $2,000 across 3 separate dates. A flower delivery to an address in Lincoln Park that was not the rental property. A parking garage in the Gold Coast neighborhood. 3 times in 2 weeks. At $10 an hour for 6 hours each time. Serena's lifestyle brand did not operate out of Lincoln Park. The rental property was not in the Gold Coast. The total of what I could identify as non-business expenditures over 8 months came to just over $11,000. It was not a catastrophic number on its own, but it was not the number. It was the evidence. I called Patrick that Friday morning. He was quiet for a long time after I read him the list. Then he said, "Frank, you understand what this means for the penalty clause?" I said, "I do." He said, "This is textbook breach of fiduciary duty. These are documented personal expenditures run through a business account. Combined with the administrative lockout, we have a strong case." I said, "I know." He said, "You want me to send the demand letter?" I said, "Not yet. Patrick, I need to understand what is actually happening here first." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean that $11,000 is not a retirement plan. There is something larger going on, and I would like to know what it is before I show my hand." He was quiet again. Then he said, "You're building the case before you file." I said, "I'm an engineer, Patrick. I don't tear down a wall until I understand what it's holding up." The answer came from a direction I had not expected. Daniel called me on a Sunday afternoon in August. He sounded different. Not angry, not tired. Careful. He said he wanted to talk to me about the LLC. I said I was listening. He said that he and Serena had been doing a lot of thinking. He said the property was performing well, better than projected, and that they were considering expanding. He said there was a commercial space in Oak Park that could be converted to mixed use, and that the opportunity had a tight window. He said he had spoken to a lender about a small business loan against the LLC's existing assets. I let him finish. Then I said, "Daniel, the operating agreement requires my written consent before either of us can encumber LLC assets. You know that." He said, "I know, Dad. That's why I'm calling. I'm asking for your consent." I said, "How much?" He said, $250,000. I said, "Against the duplex we already own." He said, "Against the equity we've built. We have over $300,000 in equity right now. It's a smart leverage play." I said, "I need to think about it." He said, "Okay." He said, "Serena thinks you're going to say no." I said, "Tell Serena, I'll be in touch." I hung up and sat for a moment in the silence of my kitchen. Then I opened my laptop and I found the listing for the Oak Park commercial space. It had been on the market for 4 months. There was no tight window. There was no urgency. The asking price was $400,000. A $250,000 loan against our LLC's equity, secured against the duplex I had funded at 85% to purchase a property that had been sitting unsold since April. I called Patrick back that evening. I told him everything. The statements, the personal charges, the Lincoln Park florist, the Gold Coast parking garage, and now a request for a $250,000 loan using my asset as collateral. Patrick was quiet again for much longer this time. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality it gets when he is being precise in a way that matters. He said, "Frank, you realize that if they apply for this loan without your written consent, that's a direct violation of the consent clause, not just the fiduciary clause." Both clauses triggered simultaneously. I said, "I know." He said, "That doubles the exposure for the buyout premium." I said, "I know that too." He said, "Are you going to let them do it?" I said, "I'm going to watch." I bought a simple wireless camera. I did not install it inside any home. I did not need to. What I needed was documentation of the loan application itself. And for that, I did not need surveillance. I needed patience. I waited 2 weeks. Then I called the 3 commercial lenders whose names appeared most frequently in small business loan advertisements for the Chicago suburbs. On the 3rd call, I gave the account number of Callaway Family Holdings, LLC, and explained that I was a co-owner reviewing financial activity. The loan officer was professional and careful. She could not confirm specific application details, but she did confirm that an inquiry had been run against the LLC's assets in the previous 10 business days. Serena had filed the application without my signature. Patrick had the demand letter ready within 48 hours. It cited the fiduciary clause. It cited the consent clause. It cited $11,240 in documented personal expenditures drawn from LLC funds. It cited the unauthorized loan inquiry against jointly held assets. Under the penalty provision, both violations together triggered my right to demand a compulsory buyout of Serena and Daniel's interest at fair market value, plus the 30% premium. Or alternatively, to demand their interest be transferred to me entirely in lieu of damages. He asked me when to send it. I said, "Give me 48 hours first." I had one more thing I needed to understand. $11,000 in personal charges and a $250,000 loan application were not the behavior of someone building a family investment. They were the behavior of someone preparing to leave. The Gold Coast parking. The Lincoln Park delivery address. The Creator Kit subscriptions. I had a name and address from one of the florist receipts, and I sat in my car outside a coffee shop in Lincoln Park on a Thursday morning with a cup of coffee going cold in my cup holder, and I watched a man in his mid-30s walk out of an apartment building carrying a laptop bag and a reusable grocery sack. I did not know him. I took one photograph for my own records and I drove home. I am not a vindictive man. I want that to be clear. What I did next was not about revenge. It was about my son. I called Daniel that evening. I told him I had made my decision about the loan. I told him I was not going to consent. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had expected that. He sounded tired again. Not the fighting kind of tired. The kind that comes from a weight you have been carrying for too long. I asked him when the last time was that he and Serena had sat down and talked about where they were headed. Not financially. Just as a couple. He said, "Dad, what kind of question is that?" I said, "The kind a father asks when he thinks his son is getting ready to get hurt in a way that has nothing to do with real estate." There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to know I landed somewhere real. He said, "I don't know what you mean." His voice said that he did. I drove to Daniel's house the next morning. I brought the bank statements. I brought the printed receipts. I brought the photograph. I did not say anything when I laid them on the table, except, "I think you need to see these before anything else happens." I have never watched my son age 10 years in 10 minutes before that morning. He sat at the table, and he read through every page without speaking. When he got to the photograph, he stared at it for a long time. He turned it over face down on the table. He pressed his hands flat on the tabletop like a man steadying himself on a ship in a storm. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." He said, "She told me the loan was just exploratory." I said, "It wasn't." He said, "She said you'd understand once the deal came together." I said, "Daniel, there was no deal. Something. Once the deal came to me. Once the deal came to me." He cried. Not the kind of crying you perform to get sympathy, but the kind that happens to a person against their will, that comes up from somewhere deep and involuntary and private. I sat across from him and I let him. He asked me what I was going to do. I told him the truth. I told him Patrick had a demand letter ready and that under the operating agreement, I had the legal standing to compel a buyout at fair market value, plus the 30% penalty premium, which on current valuations came to approximately $1.4 million. I told him they did not have $1.4 million. I told him the alternative was to transfer their interest to me in lieu of cash, which meant they walked away with nothing from the investment. I told him I was not there to destroy him. I was there because he was my son, and because he deserved to know the truth before a process server got to him first. He looked at me for a long moment. He looked like the 9-year-old boy who once came to find me in my workshop to tell me he had broken Carol's favorite lamp, and stood there unable to speak for almost a full minute before the words came out. He said, "Dad, I am so sorry. Not for the money. For letting this happen. For not seeing it. For not protecting you the way you deserved." I heard his voice break on that last sentence, and I had to look out the window for a moment, at nothing in particular. I said, "An apology is a beginning, son. It is not a destination." Patrick filed the demand the following week. Serena retained her own attorney, a sharp woman from a downtown firm who sent back a 12-page response questioning the validity of the fiduciary clause and characterizing the personal charges as, quote, reasonable business development expenditures consistent with growing the LLC's brand presence. Patrick sent back 4 pages. The 4 pages contained every receipt, every transaction date cross-referenced with public records showing Serena's location that day, and a single sentence at the end, noting that the penalty clause did not require intent to defraud, only documented breach. Her attorney stopped responding after 72 hours. The compulsory buyout was agreed to under mediation 6 weeks later. The duplex, by that point, had been appraised at $1.6 million. Fair market value for their combined 49% interest came to $784,000. The 30% penalty premium added $235,000 on top of that. They owed me just over $1 million they did not have. The mediated settlement converted the cash obligation into a full transfer of their LLC interest to me. Every percentage point. In exchange, I agreed to release any further civil claims. Serena moved out the week the settlement was signed. She left a note for Daniel on the kitchen counter. Daniel photographed it and sent it to me. It said she was starting fresh on the West Coast and that she had always been honest with herself about what she needed, even if she hadn't been able to be honest with everyone else. There was no apology. There was a postscript asking Daniel to forward her skincare subscription box to a new address in Los Angeles. The money she had moved out of their joint savings, nearly $60,000 transferred in small increments over 5 months, was gone. Daniel's attorney said they could pursue it, but the recovery odds were modest. I told him to let it go. Some lessons have a tuition you cannot recover. Daniel showed up at my door in Wheaton on a Saturday morning in October, carrying a single bag and looking like a man who has been walking through weather for a very long time. I made coffee. We sat on the back steps the way we used to when he was a teenager, and the words between us came easier in the open air than inside the house. He told me he had 2 months of savings left. He told me his lease was up at the end of November. He told me he did not expect anything from me except the chance to say in person what he had already said on the phone. That he was sorry, that he was ashamed, and that he understood completely if I needed distance. I told him I had thought about it carefully. I told him I was not going to pretend that the past year had not happened, because it had. He had been passive, when he should have been present. He had let a pattern develop that he had the intelligence to see and the cowardice to ignore. I told him that was the truth, and that I was not going to soften it for his comfort. He nodded. He didn't argue. I also told him that I had a property now, a duplex, fully mine, and that the unit currently generating the lower rental income needed work before I could raise the lease rate. New kitchen fixtures, refinished hardwood, fresh paint throughout. I told him I needed someone to manage that project, someone I could trust to show up and do the work honestly. I told him the pay was fair, but not generous. I told him there was a small apartment above the detached garage on the property. Nothing fancy, clean and functional. I told him he could live there while the renovation was underway, at cost, and that after that we would see. He looked at me the way people look when they are trying to determine whether something is real. He said, "You'd do that for me? After everything?" I said, "I am not doing it for the man who let me get locked out of my own accounts for 8 months while he looked the other way. I am doing it for the man sitting here right now who is willing to start from the bottom and rebuild honestly. Those are 2 different people, and I am choosing to deal with the second one." He finished his coffee. He put the mug down on the step between us. He said, "When do I start?" I said, "Monday morning, 7 a.m. He said, "I'll be here at 6:50. He was. It took me a long time after Carol died to understand that the loneliness of grief is not just about the person you lost. It is about the version of yourself that existed only in relation to them. The person who laughed at their particular jokes and knew where they kept things and understood, without needing it explained, what mattered. That version of yourself becomes orphaned, and you spend months walking around as someone incomplete, bumping into the furniture of your own life. What Serena and her plan and the entire miserable year that followed took from me was not the money. Though the money was real. What she took was the illusion that I still had a family intact, that the thing Carol and I had spent 41 years building had survived her. She showed me the cracks in the foundation. But here is what I know now. Standing on the small back porch of my house in Wheaton, on a November evening, with the lights of my duplex property visible 2 miles east, and my son inside, making dinner because he asked if he could cook. And I said yes. Cracks in a foundation are not the end of a building. They are information. A good engineer reads them. A good engineer understands what caused them and decides what to reinforce. I reinforce the operating agreement. I reinforce the language of the trust. I reinforce the boundary between love and liability. And slowly, imperfectly, one honest Monday morning at a time, I am reinforcing my son. The duplex is currently appraised at $1.75 million. Both units are fully leased. I have already been approached by a commercial broker about a mixed-use property in Evanston. I am taking my time. I am reading every line. Carol would have had a great deal to say about all of this. She was never one to keep her opinions contained when they mattered. She would have been furious about the basement. If there had been a basement, she would have said something sharp and specific about Serena that would have taken 3 seconds to deliver and 3 days to stop being right. And then she would have asked me about Daniel, the way she always did, directly and without flinching. She would have asked me what I was going to do to get my son back. I would have told her exactly what I told him that Saturday morning on the back steps, that I was going to make him start over, that I was going to make him work for it, that I was going to hold the line until he proved to both of us that he was capable of standing on the right side of it. And Carol, who understood the architecture of people better than any building I ever designed, would have nodded and said, "Good. That's the only thing that works." She was right about most things. I'm still learning to agree with her out loud, even when she isn't here to hear it. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think my son earned that second chance? Or did I give it too soon? Tell me what you think. I'll be reading every one.